So, good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's Environmental Forum. This is actually our first public forum of the semester. We've had a little bit of a few issues along the way, and one of our speakers in particular was impacted by the floods and was not able to make their first presentation. So Ty is actually our very first presenter of this semester, and I'm actually super excited to have Ty be a speaker with me. Ty's presentation, Climate Disruption, what do we know and what can we do? She's just back from the Climate Reality Leadership Training Program in Atlanta, Georgia, and many of you might not know what that's about, but this is a program that's spearheaded by Al Gore, and they're working to create a network of activists committed to spreading awareness and working on solutions towards climate change, which now Ty is one of those. When describing herself, Ty calls herself a former community college instructor, having taught at Butte College for 23 years. She also, upon her retirement from here, taught here for an additional 3 years. She taught high school as well. She is a fire survivor, having lost her home in the Tubbs fire, and she's also a grandmother. Those are the words she uses to describe herself. The one thing she left out, though, is she neglected to mention that she was also a former dean here at SRJC. She served as the dean of what was at the time called Arts Humanities, Behavioral, and Social Sciences for 6 years at SRJC. Upon her retirement, she came back as an adjunct instructor for an additional 3 years before fully retiring. So she has a long history with social justice movements, and based on her personal experience, is really experiencing a sense of urgency in regard to climate disruption, and that's what she's here to share with us today. So please welcome Tyra Benoit.
Thanks so much, and like I said, it's really good to be back here. I spent a lot of hours in this auditorium, both watching teachers, going to presentations like the Environmental Forum, and I just really appreciate you being here and giving me a sense of where you're at in terms of this particular topic, because for me, personally, the whole issue of climate disruption is the most important issue of our times. And I'd like to start today by just having you close your eyes and sort of honor the indigenous people that lived in this area prior to the coming of Western Europeans and Western settlers, because I think had we learned more from the indigenous people who lived here, we wouldn't be in the shape that we're in today. And hopefully we've learned that. We're able to give birth to a movement that embraces that. And having just come back from Atlanta, where there were a lot of indigenous people present, I want to take a moment to just honor their contributions. One of the things that I did is, Katie didn't mention that I taught history and world civilizations. And so I would always talk about the emergence of civilization and what impact climate had on that. One of my students came to me when we were trying to define the term civilization, and she said, I really like this definition better. And it was an indigenous definition from the Ojibwa tribe, where the elder said, I don't think the measure of a civilization is the size of its buildings. Rather, it's how it treats the natural world and each other. And I think that's really information that can help us as we confront this. So I have been trained. A lot of the slides that you're going to see are slides that were taken from the Climate Reality Conference that I attended. Some of the slides are from other groups. And I hope that as I go through this, it will not be something where you just get depressed, because it's easy to get depressed about some of the stats and the facts and things that I'm going to share with you. But try to imagine as you go through this that you're looking at the Earth as the astronauts did in 1968 when this Apollo mission started in 1972, when this photo, the most used photo of the Earth in any presentation, and imagine this blue marble as they talked about it. And looking at it from space in 1972, even going into the Earth, it would have looked very different than it does today because of some of the damage and disruption that's taken place. So if we get a closer look, and I'm not going to put up a lot of images, fire images, because again, for me, that's something that I don't necessarily want to relive, but I think we have to recognize what's going on. And this is from the campfire in Paradise. It's not from our fire. certainly that town experienced an even greater horror than what we experienced in our own fires. Some of you said that you were impacted by the floods. Well, these aren't pictures of Guerneville, as you can probably tell. These are pictures from the Midwest, from Nebraska, right now. And what's going on there is absolutely horrific. And we need to acknowledge that it's not only our local environment, but areas across the world that are being impacted by these floods and this massive disruption, and impacting businesses, families, multi-generational experiences, and going even farther across the world. This is just recently in Mozambique, much farther away than Nebraska from Santa Rosa. But in this case, you have Cyclone Idai that just appeared a couple of weeks ago, and the destruction in an already poverty-stricken country has been massive. Here's some statistics. Inland oceans for miles and miles, 835 square miles of what used to be dry land, now inundated as a result of this cyclone. Covers as much land as New York, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Boston combined. And just as I talk about my experiences as a fire survivor, and here's an image from my life, when I think about my experiences surviving the Tubbs fire and compare my life to so many people around the world that have been impacted by climate disruption, I am truly one of the lucky climate refugees. I'm impacted by it, yes, primarily emotionally, but I'm not impacted in the same way that some of these people from various parts of the world are impacted. So I'm going to be showing you a lot of information, and I promise that after about 20 to 25 minutes of all this information, I will deal in hope, because I think there are also wonderfully exquisite signs of hope. You know, your students for recovery talk about being hope dealers, and I think that's a wonderful phrase. And I really want to be a hope dealer today. But in order to be a hope dealer, sometimes you have to recognize the scope of the problem. And the other thing that I told Katie is that we'll make all of these slides available to you as part of the aftermath of this class. I still have a Santa Rosa email, and we can get this information to you as a PDF file. So you don't have to be madly writing these things down, because I'm going to go very, very quickly and give you a lot of information. But you'll see that there are certain talking points, things that when I'm trying to convey the gravity of the situation, things that I tell my friends, my family, people that are important to me, and people like you, some of which I've never met before. So here you see my house. I had thought that I was embarking on this wonderful retirement, and within 9 months, I realized, well, that's not going to quite be what I thought it would be. Here's my house at the bottom. I don't have a little red laser on this pointer, but you see it transformed as a result. It was up in Wickiup, a little bit north of here. And what Katie didn't mention is that I'm also an avid gardener, and certainly an avid hiker. Shiloh Park was my church, so to speak. I haven't been back to Shiloh since the fires, and it was so difficult for us to go back to return to our property after the fire. So we've made the decision, as a result of something that looks like this, there's that same yard, we've made that decision not to rebuild. I totally applaud everyone who is doing that. It's so exciting, but for us, it was too difficult. So we've made some other plans, and part of the year I'm living here, part of the year I'm also living in Idaho. I have one son in the audience with his wife, take a wave, and his twin brother, as you'll see in a second, there they are, all right, a year old, playing in the dirt, because we had to play in the dirt. That was the most important thing, and I'm happy to announce that he still likes to play in the dirt. And he's married a woman that loves gardening. So what you have here, and what you're going to hear in my presentation, is things that have happened in my lifetime. I was born in 1949. He was born in 1982. And so you're going to see some generational differences that take place. But certainly one of the reasons that I'm called to do this is to not just help me overcome my own grief, but to also ensure that there's a planet for my children and for my grandchildren. As Katie said, I am primarily a grandmother, and it just better be that when this little guy who's just turning 3 next month, when he drives me around in 14 years, it better be in an electric car. That's the only thing that I'm going to definitely hope for. But these are the, is that okay? Whatever's going on with the sound? Okay. Is it something I've done? I hope not. We okay? There we go. So primarily, I'm called to do this because of being a grandmother. So let me just go through a couple of introductory things. I'm sure that most of you know this, but I think it's important that we're all on the same page. And just like those other images that I showed you at first were from NASA, this is another NASA image that shows you basically the Earth's atmosphere, this little band that makes it possible for us to all live on the Earth. And we all know that the sun is such a great gift. And in this particular case, the sun, it makes it possible for us to live on Earth. And those sun's rays come down, pass through the atmosphere, and most of the radiation is absorbed by the Earth and warms it. But since the industrial age began a couple centuries ago, you have some difficulties because some of the outgoing radiation of the sun is trapped here in the Earth's atmosphere, and that creates some problems for us. And again, I want you to know that my training is in social science, humanities, the history of things. I'm not a climate scientist, but I feel like I've gotten a fast forward into some of this information recently. So what happens, and hopefully, yeah, the little animations are working, okay? This tells you the sources of other pollution that gets into that thin little layer of atmosphere that then causes problems for us. And you see all the different things. So when we're experiencing fires, that's making a shift in the atmosphere. We can all feel it when we try to breathe the air. When you're flying on an airplane, oil production, crop burning, coal plants, the thawing permafrost, all of those kinds of things. The cattle. You know, there's a comment that if cows were a country, they would be the 3rd biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. If cows were, just think about that for a second. So you've got all of these gases and pollution and everything going into the atmosphere. And here we don't have all of the facts and figures because we tried to translate the pages into a PowerPoint. It's not coming up, but 110 billion tons into the atmosphere on a daily basis. Okay? And as this concentration of CO2 increases, more of it is trapped, and too much of it creates a warmed atmosphere, a warmed Earth, and then, as we'll see, warmed oceans. So here's a statistic for you. This is one that just shocked me when I heard it. The energy trapped by the pollutants and what we're putting into the Earth's atmosphere on a daily basis right now, 2019, equivalent to 500,000 atomic bombs, Hiroshima-sized bombs, not the kind of bombs we have these days, but the kind that was dropped on Japan in 1945. 500,000 Hiroshima bombs per day, every day. And the source of that is James Hansen. He's one of the premier climate scientists. He's been talking about these issues since the 1980s, trying to raise awareness about that. 500,000 per day. So just think about that. And as I said, we're going to be talking about my life, my children's life, and then my grandchildren's life. And here you have a chart that shows roughly the first 30 years of my life in terms of summer temperatures. And you have colder than normal, hotter than normal, normal. Nice little mean temperature there. And then, let's look at what happens to it. In my children's lifetime, they're born primarily 1980s onward. In my children's lifetime, the shift in temperature, look at how we don't have too many colder than normal days, but we have a lot more hotter than normal days. And these are all 97 out of 100 scientists are supporting this sort of factual information to help convince people. So the extreme events, when I was a child, used to cover less than 1% of the Earth's surface. But now, 2015, you have 14.5%. And again, you can extrapolate what that's going to be like if we don't do something, rein in our use of fossil fuels, end it completely, and move forward with some new technologies. So here's another little factoid for you. 2018, the 42nd consecutive year where the temperatures were hotter than they had been during the average temperatures of the 20th century. Okay, and we're hoping that this is all going to work. When we talk about climate disruption, and we talk about some of the figures that take place around the world, here's an image from Quebec. 90 people during the summer of 2018 dying of heat prostration. The ambulances were overwhelmed. Tokyo, 125 people died, over 57,000 treated for heat stroke. Okay. And then think about this. The hottest temperature I've ever been in is around 120 degrees. 120 degrees. Iraq, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Iraq and Iran in a little bit, 129 degrees. Anybody ever been in 129 degree temperatures? Have you? I bet it was pretty hot. Okay, so you've got this intense heat. Kuwait, the same thing. Okay, you've got almost 130 degree temperatures. Okay, and climbing. So all over the world, people are trying to deal with this. And I have a new colleague that I met in Atlanta who lives in Sonoma County. He's a retired doctor, and he's very interested in talking about the health impact of all of this. I'm not going to have time to go into that, but I'm just showing you some of the experiences that people had. So Pakistan, 129 degrees. And again, you have this situation where people are being treated. Here's 2016 in Pakistan. The government said, we're just going to go ahead and start digging the graves now because we know so many people are going to die of heat prostration. I mean, again, we're not schooled on all of this. Okay. Australia, going to a different continent. 2019, January, the hottest month on record in Australia. Wasn't quite 129, but we're up to 118 in some areas of Australia. I want my grandkids to still know that Santa can exist at the North Pole, right? And yet, 2018, the temperature at the North Pole, 50 degrees hotter than normal. And again, if we had time, we could talk about how the ice sheets melted and split and caused some of that polar vortex if you have any friends or family in the Midwest. But we don't have time to talk about that. Just suffice it to say that all this heat sometimes creates extreme cold as a result, unlike what our president might want you to believe. Okay? In my own experience, I saw the Mendenhall Glacier in a trip to Alaska in 1973 when some of my college friends were homesteading up there. And I went back in 2003, and I was shocked at the 2 miles that the glacier had receded. In The End of Ice, a book that just came out in January of 2009, the author suggests that in Glacier National Park in Montana, by 2030, all the glaciers will be gone. Right now, it's only at 75%. So These are the kinds of statistics that should alarm anyone. And again, I'm going to give you some hope. I'm just dealing in shock therapy right now, right? But I am going to give you hope because I think one of the things that we have to realize is how intensely this is affecting our planet, our people, our lives, the animals, the plants. We need to understand that so that it will motivate us, just like a lot of things have happened since the fires that have directly motivated many people to do things that they didn't think they would be doing. So, just a little bit more information. When it's too hot in the Earth's atmosphere, then the temperature goes into the oceans, because we all know that the oceans make up such a great part of the mass of the surface of the Earth. And here you have global ocean temperatures, 2018. Again, you know, this is about 1960, so they were starting to warm, but now they've gone higher and higher. And that affects a lot of things in the oceans. If you had been with me in Atlanta, obviously the fire issue isn't their big issue, it's hurricanes. It's hurricanes, it's flooding. And I just wanted to share a little bit of information about hurricanes and water vapors and all of that. So what happens, and you hear this on the Weather Channel, you hear this when a hurricane is supposed to hit, oh, there's, you know, going to be a greater intensity of this hurricane. Oh, it's building. It's a Category 3. No, it's a Category 4. No, it's a Category 5. And it's because of the warmer oceans that these kinds of things are happening. So warmer air tends to hold in the moisture. That means there's more rainfall, it lasts longer, and we can get into some statistics in just a second that given what we just experienced a couple of 3 weeks ago in Guerneville and Healdsburg, you're going to see why those kinds of things happened. So storm surge increases, sea levels rise. They're predicting now that within the lifetime of my grandchildren, 3/4 of Miami will be underwater. And people are already starting to leave the Florida coasts because of the intensities of these hurricanes. And what's also happening, and there's a little illustration I'll show you in a second, is that because of the warmer air and the warmer ocean temperatures, the jet stream is becoming wavier, like this. And when the jet stream becomes wavier like this, the moist air that comes in with a hurricane doesn't get dispelled. It sticks around for a longer period of time, and therefore it drenches the area much more completely. So Hurricane Harvey in 2017 moved into Houston, affected New Orleans, but it didn't leave, it didn't stop. It went on for 5 days. And that's unusual for a hurricane. Once usually hurricanes hit land, they dissipate, but not in this case. And you can see the amount of water that was falling. Now think about this. In Houston, as a result of Hurricane Harvey, you have scientists designating this storm as a once in every 25,000 year event. And in areas right outside of Houston, once in every 500,000 year storm. Outside of Healdsburg, during that last storm that we experienced that caused all the flooding in West County, there was a little town or a little area called Venado outside of Healdsburg, and people were saying, it's experiencing 2 feet of rain in 24 hours. Santa Rosa recorded the highest percentage of rainfall, or the highest amount of inches of rainfall in its history. Look at this. This is right after Hurricane Harvey. 5 feet. Can you imagine 5 feet of rain falling in one 24-hour period? We got to take notice. There are some things we need to do. And then 2018, it was Hurricane Florence. 2019, Hurricane Michael. I mean, the severity and the longevity of these hurricanes are wreaking havoc in these areas. And these areas are where a lot of the petroleum industry is located, coal plants, and so you have all of these toxins released into the areas, and that's why it was so important to so many people in Atlanta to be schooled on why these kinds of things were happening. Michael was the third strongest storm ever to hit the United States. So we hear about these things, and when we experience them directly, we have a reaction to it. But certainly being in contact with others who experience this kind of devastation, it's different from our fires, but it's just as daunting. So warmer air, okay, that's what we need to think about. Warmer air, because of the fact that there's all these pollutants in the air and the atmosphere is warming, more water vapor, and so we have more atmospheric rivers. How many of you have heard that term? I was thinking about that this morning as I was sitting at my computer about 7 o'clock, and it was just pouring down rain outside. And I thought, oh, another atmospheric river coming in. So atmospheric rivers are those rivers of water that just come in these massive sheets. And they're definitely increasing as a result of the warmed atmosphere. So here we have San Jose in 2017. Sonoma County, there's the Barlow, right, just a few weeks ago. And we're experiencing these things now that are called rain bombs. If they weren't so destructive, they'd almost be sort of cool looking, right? But they're so destructive. Cyclone snow bombs. When I was coming back from Atlanta, flights were being diverted around Denver because there was this cyclone snow bomb that was going across the Midwest, which is what led to a lot of that catastrophic flooding in Nebraska. A cyclone of snow. And again, those of us who live in a first world country and experience these kinds of things, it's nothing compared to what happens to people in these other places. So these kinds of extreme rainfall events, again, looking at the lifespan of my children, 4 times more often than when they were born, 1982. And in places that have never experienced this kind of thing before. I mean, one could argue that, well, Guerneville's always had a problem with flooding and people are trying to figure out what to do with that, and you know, there's been a history of this, and certainly we know that. But there are other areas that haven't experienced this kind of catastrophic flooding. And people in the third world are the ones who suffer the most extreme consequences. Here's a picture from Japan. And all of these slides came from that climate reality training. So if any of you saw the movie An Inconvenient Truth in 2006 with Al Gore, this is just his updated version. And he sent us away with about 700 of them. And I'm like, okay, that's a little bit of overkill there. I think I can make my point. So here we go with some other charts that show you the storms that we've been talking about, the floods, the fires. And the other thing that we haven't mentioned so far, but that we need to mention, is the whole issue of drought. Okay? So just a couple of quick statistics about fire. Obviously, the fire that hit us was because of the drought that California was facing, and now because of all the rain. They've said, well, the drought's over, but they still expect more fires. And the fire season that we have to plan for is 105 days longer than it was in 1970, 10 years before my kids were born. 105 days. That's like almost 1/3 of the year longer. And the total area burned. There's going to be fires no matter what. Lightning strikes, things like that. But the area that's been burned since, in their short lifetime, twice as much in the West has been burned than before that. The Camp Fire, and again, for those of us who went through the Tubbs Fire, it was horrific. But I've been working with a lot of friends and family in the Paradise area, and I can tell you that that was 10 times more horrific because people were trapped trying to get out of town. And not only are they suffering the loss of their own home or perhaps the loss of a loved one. They're suffering the loss of their entire town. The school that I taught at for 10 years, Paradise Intermediate School, the stories that are coming out of that school, they're holding classes in an Osh hardware store in Chico. And the enrollments have dwindled from about 700 students to about 100 students. The last I heard, all the teachers on staff had gotten pink slips. So you talk about the trickle-down theory that goes as a result of some of these things. And it's happening all over. It's not just in the American West. This is north of the Arctic Circle in Sweden. I was in Greece last summer. This flew right over this fire. So you've got fires in Chile, South America, 1 million acres, thousands left homeless. And if you've never experienced that feeling, I know that those of you who are directly impacted by the Tubbs fire, when you wake up in the morning and you realize that you're homeless as a result of climate change, you begin to think, okay, I got to do something more about this. So this is an interesting statistic. Again, $653 billion over the past 2 years. And that's losses of income, losses of business income, insurance settlements, all of those kinds of things, all across the world. 653 billion. 28 billion in damage from droughts. And here's some of the statistics about what's going on in the Middle East with drought. And a lot of us don't link climate disruption to the events that are taking place there. But in Iran, their country is facing a massive drought. The land is actually splitting. And as you're going to see, they're going to suggest that parts of the Middle East may not even be inhabitable in a few years. And that leads to things that happen to people and where they're going to live. So in this case, they're saying, this keeps going, people aren't going to be able to live there. Well, that's going to create more migration, more immigration as a result of not being able to live in certain places. So again, here's a food protest as a result of one of the droughts. We talked about Pakistan earlier and the impact that the heat is having on individuals, and it's creating issues across the Middle East. How many of you have heard of the Arab Spring and what happened in Egypt? Well, that started in Tunisia, and it started partially as a result of climate disruption and the drought that was developing there. How many of you have heard about Syria and ISIS and all of this over the past few years? When you look at Syria, here's a farmer. This is before ISIS, okay? 2006, 2010, there was a massive drought in Syria, and here's a gentleman saying, I used to farm for wheat, and now it's all desert. It's all dried out. 60% of Syria's land prior to its civil war was drought-stricken. And that drove all these people into the cities that then exacerbated the situation with the civil war there. So you have migrants coming out of Syria, crossing in those boats through the Mediterranean. We saw all the images. And our media would have you believe, oh, this is all because of ISIS. That's only a small part of the picture. All of this is happening because, and this is a telegram that our government received from the government of Syria saying, economic and social fallout from the drought is making it impossible for us to deal with this. So you destabilize the country, that allows for the civil war to break out, and as a result, thousands of people die, thousands of people move, and it's all a prelude to what we're experiencing right now. This is a comment about the kinds of expectations we could have related to climate migration. I mean, for some of us, the migration is moving from California to Idaho or moving from California to other places in the United States. The world could see, as a result of some of these changes that are taking place, unless we do something about it, they could see 1 billion climate immigrants. The caravan that we heard so much about in the news, the caravan. Did you ever ask yourself, what makes people do that and what's causing them to leave the country? And we all heard about the gangs and the violence and everything else. One of the things that you didn't hear about was the drought that was going on in these areas and what causes people to migrate when they don't simply have enough food to eat. You don't have enough food, you got to do something. And we're going to see more and more of that climate instability happening as a result of these conditions. So, one last comment, and then we're going to talk about, now that I've shocked you into thinking, okay, what am I going to do about this? What can I do? We're just going to mention our animal friends here for a second. Because these are also, these next 5 slides, they're moving as well. It's not just the people that are moving. And they're experiencing a lot of hardships too. When you think about my grandson's lifetime, we could lose 50% of all species during this century. And I don't know about you, but I don't want that to happen. Something's got to be done. Here's another statistic about marine life, and there's all sorts of other things we could talk about with the oceans. In the time period closely connected to my kids' lives, populations of marine vertebrates declined 49%. And then this one, turtles are my favorite. I love turtles. Sea turtle sex is determined by temperature. And at the northern edge of Australia's Great Barrier Reef, 99% of young sea turtles are female. That's not a good sign. That is definitely not a good sign. So, we have solutions though. We have things that we can do. Are you ready to do something? Are you ready to make some changes? And they can be small changes, they can be long-term changes. You can get active. There's lots of ways, there's lots of things that you personally can do. And some of these will surprise you, I think. Okay? So let's talk about some of these solutions. And let's talk about what's happened over the past 20 years or so. Now, in the case of wind capacity, how many of you have heard about renewable wind energy? We have a ton of wind on this planet. And there were predictions in 2000 that by 2010, wind capacity would increase and that we would have the ability to be able to harness the wind. The predictions were really low. Look at this. The reality is that by 2018, the goal was exceeded by a factor of 20%, or 20 times, not 20%, 20 times. That means that there's a lot of effort being put into wind technology. And what's happened is that the wind energy capacity has gone sky high and the cost has dropped dramatically, both onshore and offshore. Now you ask yourself, well, how does that affect me? Hang on, and I'll share with you how that affects you. Because if you can get off fossil fuels, if you can figure out a way to have a plan to transition to a different way of getting around, using public transportation perhaps, using an electric vehicle, at least using a hybrid, you can use and harness some of that wind power. Wind could supply worldwide electricity consumption 20 times over. Sorry, 40 times over. Okay. Solar energy. Here we have solar energy projections. In 2002, they said, oh, it's going to grow by 1 gigawatt per year by 2010. wait for it. The reality is that goal was exceeded 109 times. So solar energy has also the technology, the use of photovoltaics, the number of installations, look at that, since 2010, going sky high. And the cost, much less. That's why California, who seems to be at the forefront of some of this, you might despair about what's going on nationally, but statewide, all new construction in California after next year has to install solar. And those of you who are doing any kind of rebuilding or involved in that, you might find it possible to incorporate some solar design. But there's even more that we can do with that. Just like you have those little power cells out there on the parking meters, globally, that's what they're doing. Instead of putting in a lot of infrastructure, they're selling small solar panels, pay as you go, to people all across the world who are installing this. And kids, here's some kids in Africa who are using solar power to power their computers. Now, we're going to have some tremendous technological breakthroughs in the next few years because there are a lot of people working on these issues. And if we, as a first world nation, can do something to eliminate our use of fossil fuels over the long haul and support efforts like these, it's going to make a major difference. And basically, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we have 12 years. So it's got to be quick. But think about, what's your 12-year plan? Here's countries planning a fossil fuel vehicle phase out. Now, you won't see the United States up there, but there are states that are working on this, and California is one of them. So you have a number. Norway is an example. Read more about Norway and what they did in 1 year to get off fossil fuels. It's absolutely remarkable what they've done. Sri Lanka, by 2040, will be totally fossil fuel free. Sweden by 2045. We've got to get people in the planning process who are going to make those kind of commitments as well. Here's the auto manufacturers that are moving to electric vehicles. Look at that list. I mean, you look at all of these, you've got foreign car manufacturers, American car manufacturers, and this is what General Motors said. The future's all in electrics. And we as consumers have to demand those kinds of shifts. And we have to think about our own consumption habits because we're all part of the problem. We're all part of the problem. And buying a hybrid might be a good place to start. The prices are guaranteed now that there's more research and development going into these, dropping those prices. Because I know you're probably sitting there, I'm a poor, starving student. A, maybe I don't even have a car. And B, I can't certainly afford an electric vehicle. But what happened in Norway is that the government started subsidizing people to shift over. They recognized the gravity of the problem, they took action, and within a year, they were turning things around. Here's Volvo. This year, Volvo says, we're not making any more totally fossil fuel vehicles. We're only making hybrids and electrics. Now again, you've got Sweden and Norway and Denmark and some of those countries really laying the foundation for some of this change that has to take place. So those are broader kinds of things. And again, I want you to think, as I am, about what kind of a car I drive. You know, I'm in replacing my home. I've bought a much smaller home, but it's going to have solar. It's going to have an electric charging station in the garage. I'm taking from things that I don't need and creating a new house with things that will help with the planet. Going electric throughout the house. And there's ways of doing that. But what can you do? Well, obviously, I don't need to be talking to a lot of you. You're probably, some of you, already doing it. You're probably involved in some of the environmental organizations. And it doesn't matter which one you get involved with, but get involved somehow. At least keep up with their newsletters. At least think about these kinds of things. If you can make a small contribution, that's great, but that's not absolutely essential. It's just being a part of it being a part of what's going on. So here's Greta. I mean, she's my new hero, right? Along with one of my old heroes, Jane Goodall. She's making a difference. She's just not letting those world leaders off the hook. She's saying, this is my future. You need to do something about it. And we can all support her. At SRJC, I know you have 2 student organizations. One's affiliated more with the student government. See what you can do to get involved with the Student Sustainability Committee or the ECHO leaders. Get involved with those things. Do something. If you want to get involved with a broader organization, 350 Bay Area, 350 Sonoma, the Center for Climate Protection in Sonoma, I mean, there are so many great organizations that you can get involved with. And if you feel like it, and I know this isn't for everybody, but it's certainly for me because, you know, I'm a child of the 60s, so I'm used to these kinds of things. Went to a lot of demonstrations for, you know, various causes. I feel comfortable. Maybe that's not where your comfort zone is, but support the people that are there and spread the word, because the more people who get out into the streets, the better off we're going to be, and that's Greta's basic idea. And for goodness sakes, make sure you're registered to vote, because there are a lot of really good, important issues that are going to come up locally and statewide. You've got somebody that's young and trying to change the system as much as she can in Congress right now, and she's getting blasted by some of these old dinosaurs that are my age that are so embarrassing. And it's like, please, you know, support these kinds of things and vote. What former Vice President Gore said is that voter suppression and the idea that they don't want you to vote because they know how you're going to vote is a climate disruption issue. And there are so many people's votes who have been suppressed that could make a difference. And so working to make sure that, and in California we don't have the same kinds of problems that they have in Georgia and Florida, but certainly making sure that you are registered. Or in my case, since I'm living in 2 places, I decided I'm going to vote in Idaho. And I voted in the last election in Idaho because I had spent more time last year in Idaho than I'd spent in California. And gosh, Idaho needs my vote a lot more than California does, because I know the direction that California is going in. There's ways that you can get involved to help phone bank voters in other states and make sure that people get out to vote, because they're banking on the fact that people are not going to exercise their right to vote. And oh, by the way, the other thing you need to be aware of is that President Trump keeps talking about how he's going to pull us out of the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement isn't the end all, certainly, but it's a beginning, it's a start. Every country signs on to that. Do you know that President Trump cannot pull us out of the Paris Accord? The day that the United States can withdraw from the Paris Accord is the day after the next presidential election. So that's why it's so critical that you get out there and that you organize. Don't mourn, organize. 350 Bay Area has gotten all these cities to sign on to a climate emergency. There's effort in Petaluma to do this. There's effort in Santa Rosa. If you want to get involved with that, email me, or you can also just contact 350 Bay Area directly. Some of you in here are faculty and staff. Your retirement systems, there is a large movement trying to get them to divest from fossil fuels. How much do you know about that? Can you write a letter? Can you support that group? Again, you can find all kinds of information about fossil fuel resistance, because it's our future that's at stake. Sonoma Clean Power. Again, the Center for Climate Protection has done some amazing things. We're harnessing out of the geysers up in northern Sonoma County. And in certain places, when we lived in Wickiup, we subscribed. Sonoma Clean Power was our provider, not PG&E. So find out if your community has access 100% renewables. So that's really important. And then, and this is some of the final stuff that I'll say, and we'll open it up for the last 15 minutes of questions. There are some amazing things that you can do personally. This is a book that was published in 2017. I don't know if any of you are aware of it. Paul Hawken was just in Sonoma County last week at a summit, and he was talking about some of the ideas that have come up. So the whole idea of drawdown is it won't just be enough to stop where we're at. We've got to bring the CO2 out of the Earth's atmosphere and put it in the ground, or put it in cement, or put it in all sorts of things. But there's things that you can do. And this was the shocking one to me. I figured this one out. You know, this is going more towards a vegetable-based, plant-based diet, becoming vegan if you want to, vegetarian, but certainly if you continue to eat meat, the advice is just eat a little bit less meat. If you can't get yourself off of meat, eat less. Just try to eat more of a plant-rich diet. And the reduced food waste, his point was that in the third world, there's not a lot of food waste. And certainly when I was in college and a starving student, I didn't have a lot of food waste. I ate everything. But for people who now purchase food, like you go to Costco, you go to Trader Joe's, you buy all this food, do you know what the percentage is of food waste in the United States? And think about it. You plant something, or you grow an animal, you put that, you market it, you take it to the grocery store, you go down there, you buy it, you put it in your refrigerator, you don't eat it all, you throw it away with a plastic bag. It's estimated by Paul Hawken that 40% food waste in the United States. And that if we could just cut back on our food waste, there would be less trucks carrying all that food to market. There would be less plastic in the landfills, all of those kinds of things. Supporting girls and family planning, organizations that do that. He said, if a girl gets an education and she completes high school, chances are she's probably only going to have a couple kids. If she gets married at 13, 14, chances are she's going to have 5 or 6. What can help the planet? Family planning, educating girls. So there's all sorts of things that you can do. And feel free, if you want to, after the talk, to look at this. The book has amazing ideas in here about what you can do on an individual basis. So I'm going to finish with these 2 photos. One of them is from my fire. It was this one right here. And some of you know Warren and Nancy Rood. That was from their homestead up in Bennett Valley. And mine, when it survived, the ceramics survived, right? That's when we went back to sift. We found a lot of things like that. And I had gotten this from a colleague at Butte College who had given it to me. It's a sake jar, and he had given it to me when I left in 2007 to come to SRJC. And I texted him a picture, and he said, do you remember what that is all about? You remember what it says? And I said, no. I said, I can't remember. And he said, it translates into good fortune. And I was like, wow, how is this going to be good fortune? But I will tell you that on a deeply personal and spiritual level, there have been a lot of changes that I've made in my life. And I ask myself, I say, would you be out here going to a climate reality conference speaking about this? You were ready to retire. You were ready to give up doing presentations. But here you are. So it is good fortune in that sense. It's created something else that I was always passionate about, but I had kind of thought, well, I've done my part. 50 years of activism, I'm going to just retire now. But no, I'm not. And to my grave, I will continue. I think the other thing with Warren and Nancy's photo is the idea that, yes, we have all this negative information, but somehow we've got to calm ourselves, and we've got to say, it's important that we do this for the future, for us and for the new generations. So thank you for coming. I want to open it up to questions. And make sure that I haven't blasted you with so much information that you're like ready to throw in the towel and say, well, now I'm depressed. What can I do about this? So, does anybody have any questions or comments? Katie, do you have a...
No, I don't.
No? Okay, so I'll repeat the question. Go ahead.
You're going to leave if you go out the back, please.
Go ahead, thank you.
One of your last points was well taken, and that has to do with population growth rate. I was born in the same year that you were and grew up in the 60s and the 70s, and one of the prominent movements was zero population growth rate. Well, whatever happened to consciousness about that? We look at all of the human catastrophes and disasters you're profiling today, and what's one of the root causes that there's so much human loss?
Overpopulation. So the comment was, you know, when we were growing up, there was an individual by the name of Paul Ehrlich that was talking about population growth and family planning and all of that, and how much of an impact that would have on the future of the planet. And in some areas, we have succeeded in limiting population growth, but in others we haven't, and that's why Paul Hawken consistently says we've got to do more to educate girls and limit family size, that's part and parcel of our future. So yeah, I mean, I think there have been individuals that have worked on those issues. I think also that when you have administrations who cut family planning programs and make it more difficult for women to get that information, especially young women, especially women who are not as fortunate as we are to be educated and have an open public community college system, it's much harder. And so we have to be cognizant of those differences in terms of social class. But yes, that's a really important aspect of all of this. Other comments or questions? Yes?
I have a question. Last semester I attended a biology class and I learned about some legislation for, I don't remember what it's called, and I tried to find it, but something about a carbon tax. And then also I want to know, can you tell me what that legislation is? Is it still happening? And how is that, you know, being considered with this whole Green New Deal stuff? And like, are they going to be working together for the same result, or are they going to be clashing? Is it going to, you know what I?
Yeah. So the question has to deal with the carbon tax, which has been an idea that's been out there for a long time. Do you understand what the carbon tax is? That this is the way we're going to get off fossil fuels, is to make it so expensive that people will look for other sources of energy. That's part of it. And I would suggest that in terms of the actual legislation, you saw there was one slide that said SB 100. Right. I would suggest that one of the ways to find out about the carbon tax and some of the things that are going on locally and statewide is to go to 350 Bay Area, or 350 Sonoma, or 350.org. There's a lot of 350 organizations. 350.org is the national organization, and it was started years and years ago by Bill McKibben. Basically, the number 350 comes from if we get past 350 parts per million of carbon, CO2, in the Earth's atmosphere. When it was first, you know, kind of engineered years and years ago, that was the warning sign. Do you know where we are right now? 412 and rising. And so, you know, what the carbon tax is a drastic measure, and some people support it and other people don't, because in some ways it falls retro, you know, it creates more problems for low-income people than it does for others, because you're just going to pass that on to the consumer. So, but 350 Bay Area has a lot of information about legislation that's going on currently. There's letter writing campaigns you can participate in, and I would really encourage you to go to 350bayarea.org and look at some of that legislation. And, you know, again, the carbon tax is back and forth, and some people really think it's a good idea. As far as the Green New Deal, and it was in the news yesterday because the Senate, the United States Senate, said, no, we're not going to do this, and started blasting Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez again. And what it's forcing Democrats to do, I think, and find out more about the Green New Deal. I don't have time to explain all the nuances of it, but if you don't know what it is, go and find out about it. Read about it. It's a very comprehensive plan. She believes strongly that radical action needs to be taken, and I agree with her. I agree that radical action needs to be taken. Now, you might not agree with every aspect of the Green New Deal, but as people were pointing out yesterday, at least it's a starting point for discussion. And what we will find out of a lot of this discussion is what's going to happen to that field of candidates that are declaring that they're going to run for president. I mean, there's Inslee from Washington who is running completely on climate change. That is his major issues. And he's bought into the Green New Deal. And Bernie Sanders obviously bought into the Green New Deal. Some of the others, they're kind of hemming and hawing and saying, well, I agree with this, but I don't agree with that. Well, the point is, let's have a discussion about it, and let's start getting some action going. And that's what Alexandria has been able to do, just like Greta, the 16-year-old that's just gone and sat outside the parliaments in Europe and said, I'm not getting up until you do something about this. And I think that's how important it is. And I'm giving you my own personal opinions. I would not have taught a class where I was quite so outspoken about this, but I can do that now because I'm retired, you know? And I can tell you what exactly I believe. I would never have gone into my classroom and said, oh, be sure you support Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I would have told my students, well, why don't you find out about it? Why don't we talk about it? But I would have never told them what my opinions were when I was teaching. But now, for me, the situation is so grave that I'm out here doing this and trying to make sure that people are listening. Question?
It's not a question, it's just a matter of, I was going to present an opportunity for the students here that want to get more involved on the campus. I am actually chair of the Student Sustainability Committee and VP of Sustainability.
Yay.
I was just going to say, I think it's going to be the first bona fide Earth Week is what we're having this April. It's going to start on April 22nd, which is Earth Day, and we're going to have a week-long of events. One of the pinnacle events of the week is actually called Climate Action Night, where we're going to be training students how to speak about legislation to officials so that we can actually use our voice to good. Katie is on the team with that, so if you have any further questions, you can either approach me or Katie about that. And if not getting involved as a participant in doing the training, at least come to it so you can see what's involved in actually advocating for the things that we are of the most valuable to us. So I just wanted to shout out to that. And if you want to get involved with other things on campus, you can come to me or you can go to Katie and she can direct you to me. I'll just say a small little thing. This week on Friday, we're going to be resurrecting the compost display over in Fertolini at 9 o'clock. We're going to be revitalizing that and see what happens during the month. And that's just like a comment of food waste and what we can do to reduce it. Anyways, if you have any further questions, you can come afterwards or, like I said, to the queue.
Did everybody hear that? Yes. Okay. And I think that's so essential. Thank you so much for your service and doing the kinds of things that need to be done. Composting, she brought up that idea. That's another piece of information in Paul Hawkins' Drawdown book. Think about whether you can compost. I mean, I live in a condo now, so I used to always have a compost pile. Of course, the deer would get into it and, you know, kind of mess it up over in Wikia. But what I have now is I just take it downstairs to where there's like a little exit out of the, and put the food waste out there, figuring that that's going to help fertilize those bushes and those trees, and hopefully I won't be discovered. So, you know, I mean, compost is a really important thing that you can do. And so think about how you could just start, you know, a composter in your kitchen. Yes?
Also, California is battling the offshore drilling threat currently, and I recommend people look into that a little bit more, because that's kind of like stopping it at the source.
Right.
It's our coast directly, which is a marine sanctuary, and they're trying to override that. So.
And would you recommend that they go to 350 Sonoma, the Sonoma Land Trust? Where should they go?
Gosh, it's, I think, I don't know, it's written by our congressman, Jared Huffman.
Right.
And,
So she's talking about stopping the offshore drilling, because from San Francisco up to, where does it end right now? Point Reyes?
well, I think it goes up to Oregon, but.
Oh, okay. But there are parts that are really protected, and there are parts that are only sort of semi-protected. And so if they start the offshore drilling again, that's going to impact all of us. And so, and that's what some members of Congress and our president want to start, and the fossil fuels industry, obviously. So again, one of the things we have to figure out is how do we stand up to the fossil fuels industry? How do we take action ourselves personally to do this and combine those kinds of things? And so if you're very interested in stopping the offshore drilling, go to Jared Huffman's website. Perhaps she said that he's pioneering some of the legislation. Is that right, Katie? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Some of the ocean organizations around there too, surf riders.
Did you want to add something, Alexa?
I just wanted to ask a question. I know we're almost out of time.
Yeah, almost out of time. Are you getting us?
Yeah, I just wanted to really quickly ask, I mean, I've heard of the Climate Reality Project. Is there some subset group that's specifically working on environmental justice in this? And if, you know, is 350 also doing that, or are there other organizations where that's their focus?
So her question has to do with climate reality and environmental justice. And climate reality is really at the forefront of the environmental justice movement. I mean, when I was in Atlanta, one of the activities that we did was there were 2,000 of us, by the way, from 40 different countries. So we've got a network, and there's a total of like 9,000 people that have been trained in prior trainings. And we had a moral call to action at the Ebenezer Baptist Church. There were faith traditions reflected from all across the globe. And that's one thing that I didn't state, is that if you're working in a faith community, and also if you are interested in the issue of environmental justice, there is a vast amount of information on the Climate Reality website, climatereality.org. One of the things that they wanted us to do was to go back to our communities and organize Climate Reality chapters. There's one in San Francisco, and I felt like there's so many environmental organizations already in Sonoma County that I would prefer here to work through them, but you can get a lot of information about the environmental justice tie-in, and it's so interconnected. The panels that we heard there were so moving about these struggles that people are having in the Southeast, but certainly all across the country as we transition from coal plants into more renewable energy. And in the end, it's going to all be better, but in the process, it's very, very difficult. And so, yeah. And the other thing is, if you have any other groups that you'd like me to speak to, I'm happy to come. I'm happy to work with others. And when I go back to Idaho, I will form a Climate Reality chapter because there's not a lot of environmental organizations there. So I figure they have to get sort of kick-started. There's conservation groups. People in Idaho love their land, but most of them are in denial about the climate crisis.
I put it up for you.
Oh, good.
Okay, so with that, we are out of time, but I do want to thank you very much, Ty, and everyone else. Thank you so much.
Thanks to all of you, and just keep the faith. Keep doing it. Keep calm and carry on.
And just real quick, for those enrolled in the Environmental Forum, we do meet next week as well, April 3rd. I will make the slides available for you, but you're